Hi, Eric. Thanks for joining us today. The Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program's work is only one very small part of all the invasive work that happens around the Adirondacks. And we are very fortunate, all of us, the collective we here on this call, to have the Adirondack Watershed Institute doing the amazing work that it's doing in the region. And Eric is going to give us an update about what they found out with the watercraft inspection steward program throughout the summer. And then he'll be turning it over to Michale, who will be giving us our feature presentation. Eric, as some of you know, he's pretty well familiar to some of you, but he started as a watershed steward in the Cranberry Lake area. And so he did this, he was the steward for a number of summers. He knows what it's like to stand there at the boat launches and talk with all the people who are coming in. And he then took a management role within AWI of actually running the steward program. He actually went to school at Clarkson. So between Clarkson and Cranberry Lake, he spent a lot of time in the Northern Adirondacks. And Eric, thanks for joining us today. Are you able to pull up your slides and share the screen? All right, turn it over to you, Eric.
Okay, can I get a little confirmation that the screen is up? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. And I appreciate the introduction, Tamara. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to kind of probably move a little bit quickly because I want to make sure that Michale has enough time to squeeze in her presentation as well. So I'm going to be going over a really brief program history. I'll touch on our training a little bit. I will cover the species interception rate and also our 2021 data. So to get things started here, the program grew in 2011 and again in 2015. You can see that our decon program has also grown from 2015 straight up through 2011. And these are the number of boats that have been inspected kind of historically throughout the program. You can see starting off in the year 2000 when we began, it was a relatively small program straight up until around 2011. The program grew a little bit then. And then you see an explosion in the year 2017. And if you noticed from the previous slide, our numbers of inspections don't increase much in 2015 and 2016, even though our program grew significantly at that time. But that's because we were working under different grants that required us to work at less traveled boat launches. For instance, we were working at a launch in Hubleton on the Grass River that was not very high volume, whereas now we are working at extremely high volume launches all across the Lake Champlain areas and also Great Sacandaga. So moving on to our training, we held our training from May 18th to May 28th over a 2-week period. And we used a slightly modified version of what we did last year due to COVID. We combined 3 days of online virtual training from May 18th to May 20th with a small group in-person hands-on trainings from May 24th to May 28th. And regardless of the status of COVID, this is probably going to be our blueprint going forward. And so before I dig into this season's data, I wanted to share this slide to give everyone a better idea of our interception rates. I feel like year after year, we give this bulk data dump without really giving much context as to how frequently we find things, aside from our total numbers at the end of the season. So the first column on the left, the blue one, contains the most common species interceptions within our program. These interceptions are relatively frequent, and probably on any given day, there's at least one steward in our program that intercepts one of these species. Those are Eurasian water milfoil, variable leaf milfoil, and curly-leaf pondweed. The middle yellow column represents less common interceptions, but still, we find a decent number of them throughout the season. We encountered these species probably up to around 10 times per season. That's zebra mussel, spiny water flea and fishhook water flea, and water chestnuts as well. And then the final column you see on the right-hand side there, the green column, those are the rare interceptions. A single catch of one of these by a steward in a year is a pretty noteworthy experience. A handful of these species we've only caught, once in the entire history of our program, going back 20 years. And also with the more common species as well, Eurasian water milfoil, and variable leaf milfoil. We really only intercept variable leaf milfoil on the western side of the park because that's where it tends to be present, and the opposite tends to be true with Eurasian for the most part. So now we'll dig into this year's data with some comparisons from the previous 4 years where we were at a comparable size, as I showed from the brief program history from before when our program grew significantly in 2017. So the first number that I want to focus on is the number of boats that were inspected in 2020. As you can see, there were small but inconsistent jumps in inspections for the years prior, then a massive 23,000 boat jump in 2020. And I mean, we've covered that pretty well, and that's likely due to COVID and the increase of outdoor tourism that year, just due to the way the virus spreads. Everybody wanted to be outside and still, have a decent summer. And right next to that, you will see what seems to be another outlier. This year, we had a significant drop in inspections that's actually lower than any of the previous 4 years. Now, we can't say for certain at this time what the reason is behind this, but we suspect the main culprit for such a precipitous drop is the terrible weather that we got this summer. People don't tend to boat in large numbers when it's basically raining constantly. Another factor is that we were also short-staffed for much of the summer due to the labor shortage, but we were nowhere near short enough in staffing anywhere to account for a drop of 40,000 boats. So I think weather is likely the stronger contributing factor, and there's probably other variables that exist as well that cause that. So next, I want to talk about the percentage of boats inspected that were found to have aquatic invasive species. You can see that in 2017, that number was at 3.2%, and in 2018, it was at 3.6%. Then suddenly we have a full percentage drop in 2019 to 2.6%, and it basically holds steady for the next 3 years. Now, as a program, we have always, historically focused on education and outreach to the public, and we encourage them to clean, drain, and dry their boats. But in 2019, we really placed an additional emphasis on this aspect of the program and our training. And I also believe that 2019 was the year the commitment question in WISPA was introduced. So clearly, that's had an impact on the boating public, and our efforts are potentially having a positive effect. So watercraft decontamination has become an extremely important focus of this program. And we can see here that the number of decontaminations has steadily increased from 2017 up to 2020. Our number of decontamination stations increased over that time period as well. But with more experience, we've gotten better at encouraging and ultimately convincing the public to get their boats decontaminated. And obviously, I have this year highlighted because there's a significant drop in decontaminations performed, but that also correlates with the significant drop in boat traffic overall. We can't force people to go to the boat launches even when it's raining. However, we were able to increase our percentage of boats decontaminated up to 4.4% this year. Increasing that percentage was actually our number one goal coming into the 2021 season. We wanted to increase it to 5%, We came up a little bit short, but given all the other unexpected challenges we were faced with this year, I'm really quite pleased with a 0.5 percentage point higher than our previous high of 3.9% in 2019. And then finally, despite the fact that this year was an outlier in the number of boats inspected, we do have some pretty positive data to share. And that's that the percentage of boats found to have aquatic invasive species has remained at 2.6% now for about 3 years in a row. And while we were able to increase the percentage of boats that we decontaminated to our highest ever at 4.4%, and our goal is to continue to make that percentage go higher over the years to come. So in conclusion, we've had consistency at scale for the last 5 years, which has lent more protection to the Adirondacks and has allowed us to really kind of tweak and experiment with our methods just a little bit here and there to find the best process. We found a new training model that's efficient and effective, which oddly enough was forced upon us by COVID. So there's silver linings and everything. And there's really only 3 commonly encountered aquatic invasive species by our program. And they happen to be the 3 that are already quite established within the park. And despite the challenges of these last 2 outlier years, there is still consistency and success to be found within the data. And with that, I would like to turn it back over to Tamara.
All right, great. Thank you for that, Eric. Those numbers are really amazing. And when you look at that, I think about, a 1% drop in boats with AIS. That's 1,000 boats.
Yes.
That's 1,000 entries into our waterways. That is amazing that the education programs are really reaching so many people. And then when you add the number of boats decon, it really is, an amazing success story in how to protect our waters. There's a lot of other people on this call today who are also operating boat steward programs and decontamination programs. I do hope you had a chance to look at the partner slides. Lake George Park Commission had provided its statistics for the number of boats that were inspected by the Park Commission. They also did intercept hydrilla at one point this summer, and we are so happy to have all of the various regional programs making sure that these invasive species are not entering our waterways. So thanks, and it's a heck of a job to manage that many stewards all across the Adirondack Park. So thanks for that, Eric. I am going to turn it over to Michale, who some of you know. She is the science director at Paul Smith's Adirondack Watershed Institute. Michale comes to AWI not just with a focus on looking at water, but she has a PhD in forest biology. She's spent a lot of time looking at wildlife management issues, climate change, as well as recreational management. And she brings that all together at AWI, trying to link the entire landscape, our forested landscape with our aquatic landscape and those connections in between. So Michale has done some really great analysis and research of where our threats of aquatic invasive species interventions might be coming from. And so I'm going to actually turn it over to Michale. Go ahead, Michale. Can you share the screen or give your intro?
Yep. Can folks see that?
You're up.
There we go. Well, thank you. And that is a perfect introduction, Tamara, because what I often feel when I give a talk about this particular project is that I feel a little bit like an imposter. I am not the person who is doing what I consider to be the really hard work that all of you are doing in implementing the spread prevention measures on the ground and intercepting all of these things in the terrestrial and aquatic environment. I am just the science person that gets to come and benefit from the tremendous amount of data that have come out of this and other work. And so I really appreciate it. And I hope that that comes through in the messaging. But I'm happy to be here to share with you some of the results that we're getting at so far at a project that we've been calling the Pathways Project. This is one of 2 grants that we got from the DEC in 2019. The year that they had actually research was part of what was supported by the invasive species funding. And so in 2019, Dan and I both got some grants, and the one I'll talk about is called Pathways. His is a project that has to do with the efficacy of the steward program and of New York State, the transport law. And so hopefully in the future, we'll be able to also hear about that project. But these are 2 that we have that run from 2019 through March of next year. I took out the background slides because Eric has already covered it really, really well, but I did keep this one in just as a little bit of a an overview of some of the data that I'm using in the project that I'm working on. And the map is probably from a couple of years ago, but it's still pretty reflective of both where we have stewards. Many of those lakes are in the program year after year after year. There is some that come in and out and have been in other times and aren't every year, but the big ones we are often on. The location of the decons is much increased from when this map was created, but then the other piece that's in this map that is reflected in analysis that I'll talk about is data from the aquatic plant surveys. And I'm using data from the surveys that AWI did between 2015 and 17. I might have those years a little bit wrong, before the newer protocol. And we're also looking into whether or not there's a way for us to incorporate some of the data that Ezra's collecting in the newer bio-based modeling that he is doing. So the data that I have come, of course, from the WISPA data set, and it's data from our watershed steward program and also from Lake George and the basin program. And so again, thank you to all of you who are using this incredibly streamlined system to result in this in a large data set that we can then look at. So the project really is about trying to think about how to inform spread prevention, perhaps in other parts of New York State or even in other parts of the country that don't have the advantage of having the broad and well-established program that exists here. And also to take advantage of the tremendous amount of data that have been collected as a result of this. And so what we're trying to do is really to sort of model the invasion process kind of from 2 different angles to think about the vulnerability of lakes, both in terms of which ones are most likely to have a bunch of boats and which ones are most likely to be, have the right conditions for species to become established. And then to sort of put that information together if we can, and to think about how can we use this to understand what these potential pathways of spread are and how would we recommend ways to allocate resources both here and in other regions that again might not benefit from an existing program. So the objectives of the project, again, they're sort of looking at the invasion process from 2 angles. One is to predict the spatial pattern and intensity of recreational boating. And of course, most of our interest is focused on motorboats because we know those to be the primary vector of the arrival of the species that we are worried about. But we have put some effort into also modeling some other craft types, in part just because it's interesting and because recreation is a really hot topic in the Adirondacks, both in the terrestrial realm and in the aquatic realm. And the second objective is then to think about how can we understand which lakes are most vulnerable because they have the biological conditions that make them favorable to the establishment of invasive species. So predicting the occurrence of aquatic invasives. And then ideally to be able to put this information together in a model that will help us understand how it functions up the landscape scale, and with feedback from partners, think about how we can, again, inform landscape level management. So question 1, which lakes just get a bunch of boats? This is a picture from the canoe race, the 90 miler. But as I said, most of what we're concerned about is actually the motorized boats, but certainly there are conditions that make a lake popular for all kinds of different aquatic recreation. And what the vast majority of work that I have done in this project so far is just to try to compile as much information as I can about the lakes that are in the steward program from a variety of different angles, sort of within these different groupings of attributes that we think might determine the likelihood that they get visited by lots of boats. So within the sort of geographic and physical realm, we're looking at, where is the lake? How big is it? Just physical characteristics like depth. Is it connected to other waterways? Those sorts of factors. And then in a second category of factors that have to do with aesthetics or the degree to which a lake might be impaired, which potentially might influence someone's decision about visiting that lake, like shoreline characteristics. And what that is the percentage of the shoreline that's public or privately owned within a 500-meter buffer. Are there dams on the lake? Have there been recent reports of harmful algal blooms? Are there AIS in the lake? Are there fish consumption advisories, for example? The one that may seem less familiar to folks is that ecological integrity one. That comes from a data set that was created by Kevin McGarrigle and his students at University of Massachusetts as part of a big project called the Designing Sustainable Landscapes Project. I think he is now retired, but the project continues, and they have mapped ecological integrity in the whole Northeast, both in aquatic and terrestrial environments. There is a published paper that describes it better than I can, but it has been tested and found to be a reliable index in some cases in both of those environments. So we put that in there as kind of an overall viewpoint of impairment or integrity of a lake. And then the biggest category and really the largest time investment is really just tracking down all the potential amenities that might drive boaters to choose to go visit a particular lake. What kind of launch is there? How many launches is there? Are there, what types of game species are present in a given lake? Is there a marina? Can you rent boats? Is there a campground? And then just some simple distance measures of how far a given lake is to a nearby large or small road or large or small population center. And what I have done is to take the data from 2016 through 2020, so those 5 years, and model mean number of boats per day on lakes for which we felt we had an adequate data set. And that was 39 out of the 50 or 60 that we're working on in any given year. And those were lakes for which we had a consistent steward presence for at least 30 days during June, July, and August. We do have some pieces in the WISPA data set of launches that were represented just for a day or just for small periods of time. So we took the lakes that we had the best data for and those 5 years and modeled the number of boats per day. And what I did, this is the model for motorboats. In each case, both for motorboats, jet skis, canoes, and kayaks, was to do a single variable regression. I'll go back to the other slide for just a second. Looking across all these predictor variables, of course, a bunch of them are intercorrelated. So we put all the data into the database, but then we pared these down to 18 individual potential predictors that weren't correlated to one another and did single variable regressions and then a couple of multivariate regressions to predict mean boats per day, both on the weekend and on the weekdays. It turns out that the spatial distribution of where boats are on the weekend and the weekdays is extremely similar. The predictors are the same. It's just that there's about twice as many boats on the weekend. So for motorboats, the best model was driven largely by lake area, but then how big was the lake, how far away is it from an interstate, and does it have a marina or not? So none of this is rocket science, but it does sort of show you that, the size of the lake is a really key driver. I don't have slides for the other categories, but jet skis were best predicted by the number of launches on a given lake and the amount of private land on the shore. Kayaks and canoes are harder to model, particularly from this data set, of course, because we're sort of geared toward the big launches where a lot of motorboats are, but kayaks, again, were driven largely by the number of launches, canoes more so by the presence of campsites and public land on the shoreline. So shifting over to the second question, this is thinking about sort of the invasibility access of this process, whereby we're trying to understand which characteristics of lakes make them favorable to the establishment of AIS. Once we have an idea of where the most boats go, what is it that predicts, if the organism gets there, does it become established in a given location? And so again, similar sort of approach. The lakes are not exactly the same because the data sets that we're using are not exactly the same. But again, we looked at geographic and physical characteristics of a lake that might be important, ecological characteristics that came from a couple of different sources, some from TNC modeling, some from our own water quality information, things like alkalinity, temperature. Here is where the information from the aquatic plant surveys comes in, and also things like the number of upstream invaded waterways. And then again, this sort of category of human use and or impact that might also be important predictors of when these species are likely to become established. And I've done this so far just for these two species. And as Eric pointed out, and as you all know really well, these are the ones we have the most of. It may be that I'm not sure how well we'll be able to model some of the other species because the records are just pretty sparse to create a model from. But for Eurasian water milfoil, the top multivariate model included longitude. So there is this, as Eric mentioned, this strong east-west patterning of more Eurasian on the eastern side of the region. And the top model also included the number of connected waterways. Is this water body part of a sort of chain of lakes? And then within the aquatic plant information, the richness of the native plant community was an important predictor. The others on that list were also good though. So the top model has longitude, connected waterways, and native plant community richness, but upstream invasive waters and the predicted boat traffic from the first part of this analysis are also good predictors of where Eurasian water milfoil is. And then last, I have alkalinity and calcium in red, and that's because, again, we don't have the same exact lakes that we have water quality data for and steward data for and aquatic plant survey data for. It's unfortunately all different sets of lakes, but if you subset the data down to those, we also have water chemistry data for from our long-term water quality monitoring project. It looks like alkalinity and calcium are also important predictors of Eurasian water milfoil. For variable leaf milfoil, some similarities, some differences. The top model there was the number of upstream invaded waters, the overall number of amenities on a given lake, so launches plus campsites plus a marina plus boat rentals, all those things sort of put into one. And again, that factor of native plant community richness, that was the top model, but again, distance to interstate and boat traffic were also important predictors for that species. And so this is where we're at this point, and I'm still working my way through the other species, and it remains to be seen how well we'll be able to do for those other species just because the records are sparse. And as I also mentioned, it may be that we might be able to in the future incorporate some of the information from the newer protocol for the aquatic plant survey monitoring as well. This next slide always takes a minute to come up. So we can think about sort of the last phase of this project being the phase where we try to put the information together. We have some ideas of which lakes are vulnerable because they have high traffic of watercraft arriving with potentially bad organisms accompanying them. And then we can think about which lakes are vulnerable because they have the conditions that make them favorable for AIS to become established. The idea of the project is that we sort of use a graph theoretical approach to put these things together and see if we could actually predict some of those networks and connections that are operating in this landscape. You will recall probably that in 2014, Megan Johnstone and others, including Mike Mobley, who I know is on the call, put together a wonderful paper that was summarizing data from 2011 through 2013. And part of what they did was to talk about and map overland transport networks and these sort of spread hubs within the landscape. And that was using the information from the question that is asked of all of the boaters at the boat launch: where were you before you came to this boat launch? And so it resulted in this really interesting ability to sort of look at which parts of the landscape might be important sort of sub networks where effort should be focused. My colleague Sue O'Reilly creates these now. We call them the spider maps. And there's lots of different ways that the information can be represented on a map, but this is just one example. Just from having the data that come from asking folks where they were before they got to the launch that we intercepted them at, we can start to pinpoint these connections and identify the important networks within the region. What we want to know is, could we do this in a predictive sense for another region of New York State or another part of the country if we understand enough about what some of these predictors are? So that's the idea, and that's where that pathways terminology comes from. So I'll just wrap up by saying, of course, we know that our waterways are threatened with invasion from near and far. That will continue. This work will remain incredibly important, and it will not happen unless we have all those wonderful boat stewards on the ground doing this work. It seems like things like access and amenities appear to be important drivers of the use of lakes and determine which lakes get lots and lots of boats on them. And those are pretty simple things that we could take to a different region and use as a way of predicting where information is needed. It seems that at least so far for the 2 species that I've looked at, the richness of the native plant community and the number of upstream waters seem to be important drivers of establishment of those species. And one thing that I reflect on when I look at these data and look at the sort of those maps of all the connections is just that, we worry a lot about the connections between these waterways, of course, because they are the ways that things get from point A to point B that we don't necessarily want to move around on the landscape. But they also, I think, provide great opportunities for collaboration and thinking about how we can sort of work together in these networks. And if there ever was a biological issue and challenge, environmental problem that illustrated a large landscape scale complex challenge, it's one. And I think that the response and the program that exists here is a tremendous and needed response to the complexity of the program, to the complexity of the problem. I think we need this sort of large scale collaborative response. So again, as the scientist who's not doing any of the hard work that you guys are doing, thank you for collecting all the data and for doing it in a way that is standardized in an enormous region so that we can then take that and learn from it and sort of bring this information out to a broader scientific community. Thank you.
Michale, that is amazing information. And I built in some time for questions at the end, but Sawyer, with your forbearance, I'm going to suggest that we take a couple questions for Michale now while it's fresh in people's minds. And then we'll pick up Sawyer's presentation in about 5 minutes or so. And Michale, I want to thank you for that. And especially the plug that we are able to collect some of the standardized data